Welcome to everybody. Welcome not only to the CEU community, but a particularly warm welcome to our colleagues and friends from Budapest in general, from the great academic institutions in Budapest, from the research institutions, from the companies, from all the people who've been our partners for so many years. Our doors at CEU are always open to Budapest, and we're delighted to see you here this evening. This is the 24th lecture in the series, Rethinking Open Society. 24 lectures, all of them devoted to an honest and critical examination of what open society means. We're a university with an open society mission, but it's very simple what that mission is. It's to teach people to think for themselves, critically, dispassionately, on the basis of the best evidence, with respect for the opinions of others, and above all, with a certain kind of intellectual humility, with the ability to correct yourself when you're wrong, on the basis of the evidence. The hardest thing in life is to think for yourself, and that's what we do. Try and get us all to learn what it is to think for ourselves, and then help others to think for ourselves, and help us all to be a free society. And you can't teach people to do that unless you question your own mission, which is why we've had this series, and it's been, I think, a pivotal moment in the history of our institution. Let me now move to introduce our speaker tonight. First, with just one remark about the issue we'll be talking about. We'll be talking about inequality. And inequality is a deep puzzle for open societies. You would have thought that open societies, they have to be democratic. So why is it democratic societies are producing such worrying levels of inequality in income, in property, and also in educational attainment? One of the sub-themes, not to anticipate Thomas's lecture, but an issue on which we need to listen with particular attention, is whether universities are generating inequality. We like to think of universities as part of the solution. Hey folks, what if we're part of the problem? That would be one of the things that I think we should all think about as we listen to this lecture. If any single individual has put this question on the agenda of global politics, if any single individual has made inequality the problem of our time, with the publication of Capital in the 21st Century in 2014, it's this man, Thomas Piketty. You can quarrel with his data, you can argue with his policy recommendations, you can do anything you want, but you can't deny one central fact, and that is that no one that I can think of has used social science, particularly long series data, quantitative analysis going back into the 19th century, all the tools of social science. No one has used those tools more effectively to shape public opinion on one of the vital questions facing democratic societies in our time. Thomas will talk about rising inequality and the changing structure of political conflict for an hour. There are going to be a lot of slides, so wake up, pay attention, watch the board, and then we'll give him a high sign when he's gone a little too long to make sure we get out so we have time for questions. And the event will end at 7:30 sharp, and everybody in this room gets to have some hospitality and a reception next door or upstairs in Nader 13 after the lecture is over. Please welcome Thomas Piketty.
Thank you, Michael. So let me first apologize for the fact that, as you can see, my English sounds a lot like French, and so I hope. I hope you will be able to understand what I have to say. Let me also say, how moving it is to me to be here in Budapest at the CEU, especially after this election, and I think what I'm going to talk about, in a way, is of course very much related to this rise of identity-based politics and xenophobic attitudes, which we see in many countries, in Hungary, certainly, with a threat on academic freedoms that we perceive, particularly in this place. And, I am very moved to be here and to, testify and express my support to what you're doing here. But unfortunately, this rise of this kind of xenophobic politics, and we see it not only in Hungary, we see it in my own country, in France, and we see it in many other countries. And this research I'm going to present you today is an attempt to try to better understand this kind of evolution. And I'm very much looking forward to answer questions and talk more about what we can learn from this kind of comparison. So let me start right away. By saying that the general issue I'm trying to address in this lecture and in this research is what Michael summarized very simply. Why is it that democracy did not slow the rise of inequality? We observe, I'm going to show you some figures in a minute, but let me summarize very quickly. We observe rising inequality in pretty much every world region since 1980, although at different speed, so which shows that different institutions, different policies can make a difference, but we see a trend, a general trend pretty much everywhere. You could have expected a rising political demand for redistribution and rising sort of class-based politics, if you want, in order to express this demand for redistribution. Now, what we see, not only in Hungary, but in Britain with Brexit, in the US with Trump, in France with Le Pen, to some extent in India with Modi, and lately in Germany with AfD, is more a rise of xenophobic populism, identity-based politics. So the general question is to, why is it so? Was there something unique? If we look at this evolution in a longer run perspective, was there something unique in this more egalitarian period that we observe in the decades after World War II? Why did it happen? Why did it end? Do we need extreme circumstances, since what we've seen in the first half of the 20th century, to produce the kind of political coalition which led to a big reduction of inequality during this period? So this is the general issues I'm trying to address. So of course these are hugely complex issues, and I don't claim I have the complete answer, but at least I'm going to try to make some progress. The general perspective is politics seem to drive inequality change, both downturn and upturn. So we need to better understand the evolution of political attitudes toward inequality. And that's certainly one of the big limitations of my book, Capital in the 21st Century, is that politics is a little bit treated as a black box. I sort of suggest that the big shocks of the 20th century, the Great Depression, World War II, led to a complete change of attitude toward capitalism, toward state intervention, with the rise of the welfare state, and this is certainly true at some general level, but I don't really dig into the construction of the political coalition, and most importantly, why it did not last after that, which is what I am doing today. So before I get to the political coalition, just let me show you a couple of graphs and figures about the general evolution of inequalities that I'm trying to understand. So this is the first graph, which comes from the World Inequality Report, which is something we just published 2 months ago, which you can find online on this website. And as you can see, you have rising inequality pretty much in every part of the world. So this is a simple indicator. This is the share of national income going to the top 10%. So by definition, if you had perfect equality, it should be 10%. Okay? The top 10% should have 10% of total income. So, of course, you never get that. But as you can see, and if you had complete inequality, it should be 100%. So it has to be in between. As you can see, there's quite a lot of variation in between. So it can be as low as 20 and as high as 60. In fact, I don't show you the Middle East region, which will be at 70%, even higher than this. Because the Middle East region looks like the most unequal region in the world. I'm not saying this is the only reason for political instability, but I think it certainly contributes. In particular, the huge inequality of natural resources certainly contributes and has contributed to the political and sometimes military tension in the area. So what you see, I don't see if you see all the colors very well, but at the bottom you have Europe at the end, then China, then Russia, then US, then India. So I have put US and Canada together, not to please Michael, but because something that's new in this report, the World Inequality Report, is that we are interested in nation states, of course, but we are also interested in big regions. And sometimes looking at inequality at a level of a broad regions like Europe or like North America or like the Middle East is more meaningful because people with globalization, sometimes compare themselves not only to people in their little nation state, but to broader communities, sometimes to the entire world. So we also look inequality at the level of the entire world, but sometimes at something that's in between their own nation state and the entire world. And one of the key results we get in the World Inequality Report is that if you look at Europe, even putting together countries like Germany, Bulgaria, with huge inequality of income between these countries, inequality is not that high as compared to other countries. So when you include Eastern Europe with Western Europe, of course, inequality does increase a little bit, but at the end of the day, it's much less high than if you look at US and Canada. Actually, probably we should put Mexico with US and Canada if we want to look at a broad economic space of a size that's comparable in population to a total European Union. And then inequality will be even higher in North America as compared to Europe. So Europe has, had some success as compared to other areas of the world. But at the same time, I think it would be a mistake to tell European citizens, well, okay, look at this graph, Europe is less unequal than India or Russia or US or Brazil, so you should just be happy and stop complaining. Because, I don't think the reference point is necessarily Brazil or South Africa or Russia for European citizens. And so the truth of the matter is that including in Europe, the share going to the top 10% has increased, which means that the top income groups have had more than their share in total GDP growth, given that in many countries growth has been fairly sluggish in recent decades and you have a structural rise in health spending, pension spending, etc. This means that the purchasing power of the, say, bottom 50% wage earners has actually not increased that much. So there is a perception that globalization and economic integration, in particular at the European level, has benefited more to the upper income groups, and this is to a large extent correct perceptions, including in Europe. And it would be a mistake just to say, well, don't complain, it will be even worse in Brazil. That's not, I think, the right answer, but sometimes this is the answer that we tend to hear. So we have to be careful. Now, if we take a longer run perspective, so this is just starting in 1980, if you take a longer run perspective, this is the same graph for only 3 regions, US, Europe, Japan, starting in the early 20th century. Now you can see that, so in the previous graph, I was starting in 1980, now I start in 1900, so you can see that the rising inequality starting around 1980 came after a long period of relatively low inequality, at least by historical standards, between 1950 and 1980. And what I show in my book, Capital in the 21st Century, is that this reduction of inequality that took place during the first half of the 20th century was a very, violent evolution. It was not it didn't come from a natural economic mechanism. Well, there's nothing ever natural in economics because these are man-made institutions, legal systems, tax policy, whatever. So, there's no. But in the case of the first half of the 20th century, it was particularly chaotic. Okay, so World War I, the Great Depression, World War II led to a complete transformation, led to a complete destruction of wealth, in particular in continental Europe, but most importantly, maybe led to a complete change in attitudes towards the market, toward free market capitalism, and led after World War II to the adoption of progressive taxation, welfare state policy, which to a large extent the elites refused before World War I. So, I come in a country, France, where, people like to pretend that the country is in love with equality since the French Revolution, but the truth of the matter, there's always a lot of hypocrisy behind these kind of statements, and the truth of the matter is that France was actually the last country to adopt the income tax. I mean, in the West, the income tax was adopted in the summer of 1914, the law of July 15, 1914. And it was not adopted, it was 30 years after Germany, 10 years after Britain. It was pretty much the last country in Western Europe. And it was adopted not to pay for schools, but to pay for the war, to go to war with Germany. Okay? And then it was used for better purposes later on. But initially, it was really what made the French political elite. And actually, it's interesting to see that before 1914, the French Republican political elite had a very interesting way to justify the idea that there was no need for progressive income taxation in France. So the idea basically was, well, in France, we have made the French Revolution, so now we are a country of equals. And so, Britain needs progressive taxation. This is an aristocratic country. Germany needs progressive taxation. This is an authoritarian country, lots of very... But France, we are the country of liberty, we are the country of equal. So we don't need it. Except that when I look at my data, and this is probably the piece of data which influenced me the most in the writing of Capital in the 21st century, you see that the concentration of property in France in 1913 is just as high as in Britain and in Germany, with 70% of total wealth in Paris belonging to the top 1%. So there's an extreme concentration of property. Well, simply because being a republic rather than a monarchy like in Britain, does not really change. In 1913, landed estates don't really matter anymore. What matters is the concentration of equity, the concentration of foreign investment, real estate in Paris. And I'm very happy to be in a republic rather than a monarchy, but that's not going to really affect the mechanisms through which property gets concentrated. So at the end of the day, progressive taxation has probably a better impact. And at the end of the day, there was a lot of hypocrisy at the time. Sort of denying the high level of inequality. And it's only after the shocks, after World War I, the Great Depression, World War II, also the Bolshevik Revolution, the existence of a counter model in the East, which did certainly a lot of harm to a large extent to the countries that went through this counter model, but which also put pressure on the elites and the West to accept redistribution, which they refused until then. So anyway, to make a long story short, the reduction of inequality happened after a tremendous political shock. Then between 1950 and 1980, you had a sort of stabilization of inequality, starting in the late 1970s and early 1980s, particularly in the US. So you can see that you have rising inequality clearly everywhere after 1980, but it was particularly strong in the US. The particularity of the US, especially in the recent period, is really the complete collapse of the bottom 50%. So look at this. This is our latest estimate with Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zucman, and it just got published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. This is something I didn't have in my book, because in my book, the historical series were concentrated on the top shares. So now we have, which was one of the criticisms that was made, we didn't have very fine decomposition of the bottom group. So now we've worked more, put together more data sources, and now we have more complete series. Everything is online, I should say, all the details. So you can see, the complete collapse of the bottom 50% income share. So the bottom 50% in the US used to have about 20% of total income as compared to 10% for the top one. And now it's basically the opposite. Okay, so how can you have a bigger income share for 1% of the population for the bottom 50%? Well, you simply need to have an average income for the top one that is more than 50 times the average income of the bottom 50. This was not the case in 1960s. They only had 20 or 30 times, and now they have 80 times, and therefore it's enough to overcompensate the fact that they are 50 times less numerous. Okay, so it's as simple as that. So you have basically a stagnation. If you look at the purchasing power of the bottom 50% in the US, you have a stagnation, around $16,000 in dollars of today over this period, which when you look at academic and our colleague taking academic jobs in the US, when they get an offer at 80 or 90 or 100, they feel they are not well treated, and many of them, go way over that. Well, half of the population, has been stagnating at $16,000 per year in the US. So this is something that is quite spectacular. Where does it come from? Okay, and why is it different than in other countries? Now, what's interesting is that, the explanation that's sometimes given, in particular by a number of US economists, which is to say, well, you have globalization, you have increased competition with workers from China, India, and this is pushing inequality up, and there's not much we can or should do because globalization is good. I'm not saying it's not part of the explanation, but clearly it's a bit short because globalization also happened in Japan, also happened in Germany, in Sweden, in France. So, you need to have some more specific explanation, and clearly differences in policies and institutions seem to matter. So in the case of the US, unequal access to education can be quite important. So this is a graph which, I couldn't put in my book because we did not have the data at the time, but since then, Raj Chetty and Emmanuel Saez at Berkeley and Stanford have been able to link up the income tax declaration of the parents with the social security numbers of the students in order to produce this kind of graph. So you can see you have parental income rank, you have probability to make it to university. This is today. Okay, this was measured well for students who were in college year 2010 to 2014, so just a few years ago. As you can see, you get basically a straight line, and it's almost the first diagonal. Okay, so you almost go from 0 to 100%. Well, not quite. If your parents are very poor, you still have a 20% chance to go to university, and if your parents are very rich, you only have a 95% chance to make it. Okay, so it doesn't go from 0 to 100, but I think sometimes there is a gap between the official discourse about meritocracy, equal opportunity, and the reality of what we do, which is just too big. So, officially there's a consensus that, equal opportunity is good, meritocracy is good, and this is what we all like. But, this is what we have. So I think at some point, you always have a lot of imagination by the elite to justify their position. And I think, sometimes, I was talking about the hypocrisy of the French elite in 1914. This is another example where we have to put the facts on the table. And that's why it's important to have transparency, not only about inequality of income and wealth, but also about the access to public goods, access to education spending. And we need more transparency about that. I'm not saying there's an easy solution, but I think we can agree that we can do better than this. We should be able to do better than this. So what does it take in terms of admission system, public admission system versus private admission system? Private universities sometimes don't want the government to see what they're doing in terms of student admission, sometimes for good reason, because there's a terrible government that wants to interfere with the university, but sometimes also because they want, keep accepting students whose parents are making a big gift and don't necessarily have the best results, and sometimes they don't want to make too much effort to get more students from the bottom. We have to think collectively. What are the tools we want to put in place in order to improve this kind of situation, or are we ready to conclude that this is the best we can do and we are happy with that? Let's confront the facts. So that's certainly part of the explanation. Now, there are many other dimensions of policy, labor market institutions. There was the US used to be the country in the West with the highest minimum wage until the 1960s. It has now the lowest minimum wage. So, labor market institution. The decline of unions were important, but the fall of the minimum wage did not compensate for the decline of bargaining power union. Tax policy, so this is a short history of progressive income taxation. As you see, this is a chaotic history. Taxation is an issue on which people can fight a lot. So here you have the top income tax rate in 5 countries. So as you can see, the US and the UK for a long time had the most progressive income tax in the world, with top rate over 90%, sometimes. So in fact, the US, if you take the US between 1932, if you take 1930 to 1980, so during 50 years, half a century, on average, it was 82%. Okay, so sometimes 91, sometimes 70, makes the average, you get 82. This was only the federal income tax. You also have state income tax, 5 to 10%, depending on where you go. But just looking at federal, on average, 82. Apparently, this did not destroy American capitalism. And if anything, productivity growth, labor productivity growth was actually higher in the 50s, 60s, 70s than what it has been since the 1980s and the decline. So, I know many people are not ready for this discussion, but, it's not going to go away, okay? It will come back. Because at some point we have to confront the facts, and I think you know, the evidence is that if you have very high top tax rate, but on very high level of income, so typically these very high tax rates were applied above $1 million if you take in income of today, of annual income of today, the evidence seems to be that it is not so useful to pay top CEOs 10 million rather than 1 or 20 rather than 1. Or at least this is, you know, the way I interpret the historical evidence and the fact that the, you know, productivity growth was actually not that bad during this period. So this is for taxation of income. This is for taxation of wealth, well, inherited wealth. So you can see again, you know, UK and US, you know, with extremely high top inheritance tax rate, you know, 80% during a long time, much higher than in France and Germany. The only time in Germany when you have very high top tax rate for inheritance and also for income is actually when the tax policy of Germany is set by the Americans through the Allied Control Council. And the Americans, they don't do this to punish the wealthy Germans or the wealthy Japanese because they are doing the same at home at the same time. So for them, this is part of the civilization package of the time. You know, you bring democratic institutions together with the fiscal institutions that prevent democracy from becoming a plutocracy. So I know this looks like ancient history to many of you, but you know, this is not so old. And I think it's time, you know, to look again at this evidence. Last piece of evidence on the general, you know, landscape before I get to the political coalition part of the talk. Policy toward property, privatization, public debt, share of public ownership. So this is a simple indicator which sometimes people don't look at. This is the share of net public wealth in net national wealth. So you can see at the end of the period, so maybe you don't see the color very well, but basically you have US, UK, which have negative net public wealth. So what does it mean, negative net public wealth? It means that they have public debt that's bigger than public assets. So even if you sell all the public assets, public schools, universities, hospitals, when they are public, it's not enough to repay the public debt. Okay, so you have negative public wealth, which means that the owners of private wealth, not only they own all the public assets through the financial intermediation system and the public debt, but they also own rights, additional rights on the taxpayer money of future generations. So it could get even more negative, you know. And, you know, I don't know what's the optimum, by the way. You know, you can see that back in the 70s, Western countries had about 20% to 30% public share in net national wealth. This was a situation where public debt was much smaller and public assets were much bigger. So it was before privatization, which themselves came, you know, privatization came together and increased public debt came together very often with big tax cut, in particular for the higher income group. So this is related to the previous graph I have shown you. So China used to be communist. Okay, 70%. So now what's interesting is that it has stabilized at 30%. So in fact, for most of the housing stock has been privatized, but for the company sector, it's still more than 50% public. So basically, this 30% in China is the average between 10% public in housing and 50% in the company sector, if you want to have a look. And this seems to have stabilized around 30%, which is not so different from the levels that we had in the mixed economy period of 1950, 1980, when it's a bit higher. And, you know, look, I'm not going to say that the governance system in China for these public assets is satisfactory in any meaningful manner, and I'm not going to say that 30% or 20% is the optimum share of public wealth in national wealth. I'm just saying that negative share is really very small, okay? So, and this limits the ability of you know, the government to invest in education, to invest in infrastructure, to invest in the environment and fight against global warming, you know, which is a much more serious challenge in the long run than public debt, which is simply a debt between some of us and some other group of us. Okay, so now that I have shown you this as to introduce you to the general landscape, let's get back to the general question: is why is it that democracy is not working, at least in the sense that it is not slow rising inequality? So if you take the simplest model of political economy, which arguably is a very stupid model, but you know, we have to start somewhere, which is the median voter model. If you have rising inequality, in principle, because the median income goes down as compared to the average income when you have rising inequalities, and the median voter should demand for more redistribution. So when you have rising inequality, you should have a political response with more redistribution. Now, this is not what we've seen. We've seen more the rise of identity-based politics and the rise of more class-based redistribution. So one possible explanation, of course, is that globalization and competition between countries have made vertical redistribution between the rich and the poor more difficult to organize because people can more easily escape to tax havens or to other countries and not pay tax. If you take the extreme case, which I actually don't believe in, but where national governments cannot do anything anymore and cannot redistribute at all between rich and poor, and the only thing they can do, or the only thing people perceive that they can do, is to control who enters the country and who does not enter, who crosses the frontier or not, then by assumption, the political conflict is going to focus on this single dimension of policy, which is the only policy that people perceive can still be controlled, and you will have a pattern of political fight between the groups that perceive they have the more to lose from the migration and others, which will be quite different from the kind of vertical redistribution conflict we have in mind in the simple-minded median voter model. Now, I think that's part of the explanation, but it's not, it's too mechanical because at the end of the day, nothing in globalization makes redistribution impossible. It's not so complicated technically to fight tax havens, to decide to have a global financial register and to coordinate progressive taxation at the European and North American level. Look, if you want to do it, if governments wanted to do it, they could do it. So what's more interesting to understand is, unequal globalization is a choice. So what are the coalitions, the political coalitions that made this choice happen and make this choice sustainable today? And is this going to continue in the future? These are the bigger questions that I want to ask. So more generally, the problem with the median voter model is that it is too simplistic. Politics is partly about self-interest, but not only about self-interest. It's also about ideas, belief system. If you look at the history of inequality in the 20th century, it's highly political, ideological. People react to events, big historical events, by changing their worldview of how capitalism works. And sometimes it goes very far in one direction and then very far in the other direction. It's a complicated ideological story, not just a narrow-minded application of self-interest. So if we want to understand what's going on, we have to open the black box of political attitudes more than we do. So today I will present results from this paper, Brameen left versus Merchant right. I will not present everything. At some point, Michael or someone else will tell me to shut up and answer questions, and I will be happy to do so. But if you want to know more, you can go to this website and you will get everything. So what I do in this paper, in this research, is simply to construct new historical series on the political cleavage in 3 countries, France, US, UK, since World War II. And this is something that had not really been done before, at least not in such a systematic manner. Let me show you the kind of results that I get starting with France and with the income and wealth profile. So if you look at the income, okay, so this is the proportion voting for left-wing parties. So in France, you have lots of parties. In US and UK, this will be simpler. But because I'm making comparison with US, UK, I put all the left parties, so socialist, communist, radical parties that used to be strong in the 50s, together, okay? And then I will compare to vote for Labour Party in Britain and vote for Democratic Party in the US, okay? So that's what I will call left, question mark in this. So you can see that high-income groups don't like the left too much historically, but you really need to go quite high in the distribution of income for this to happen. Okay, in the bottom 90%, it's actually quite flat in France. It's a bit less flat in Britain with the Labour vote, which was more a lower-income party. In France, you have all sorts of counteracting effects, in particular lots of poor peasants who don't like the left too much for a number of good reasons. And so it's actually really more in the top 10% that you can see a very strong effect, which is actually diminishing over time. You can see the early point in the 50s, 60s, where you have really very low vote in the top income groups, whereas in the more recent period, it's closer to flat. Now, this is the same graph by wealth decile, and you can see that this is much stronger. Okay, so here also, the top wealth group don't like the left too much, but here you have a much more methodically decreasing group. Okay, so when you have property is a stronger determinant historically of vote than income. Okay? Because income, as I will argue today, is a complex combination of many different things. It depends on your property, if you want to set up a business, have high capital income, but it also depends on your education, which may not be perfectly correlated with property. It depends on your choice to go to public sector, private sector. It depends on all sorts of cultural dimension. It's a multidimensional object, income. So property historically has been a biggest determinant of political attitude toward left and right party, at least in the 20th century, with, high wealth group clearly don't like the left too much, and low bottom wealth group don't like the right too much. Okay, they don't feel they will represent them very well. Okay, so that's a very, very strong relation. So what I will do in this research, and what I will present you partly today, is basically the main contribution is empirical, historical. I construct the same kind of long-run series on the changing structure of electorate, which you can do. So there are two ways to know who votes for whom. One is post-electoral survey. You ask people after the election, how did you vote? The good thing is that in France, US, Britain, you have a reasonably good post-electoral survey starting in the 1940s, 50s, after pretty much every election. So you can do it over this period. Now, if you want to do it over a longer period, and for more countries, you actually have to turn to local level election results and match them with local level administrative data, income data, census data, it's less direct because you don't see the individual pattern, so you need to recover the individual pattern from this local level correlation, which is a bit more tricky, but which can be done. Now, today, I will only present you results from post-electoral survey. I should say that this research is currently being extended to many countries, including some countries in Eastern Europe, Poland, and also Hungary. And if some of you are interested, don't hesitate to contact me. I think I will come back later to the possible relation between what I find and what we have in Hungary and Poland. Although I don't have the results yet, so this will only be a speculation. I cannot be sure. Okay, so the main empirical finding, which now I'm going to concentrate with for the rest of the talk, is what I refer as the rise of multiple elite politics. So what I mean by this is the following. Back in the 50s, 60s, the vote for left-wing parties in France, UK, US was associated with both lower education and lower income. So basically, lower education, lower income groups voted more for the left, higher education, higher income, and also higher wealth group voted more for the right. So this can be described, this is what I describe as a sort of class-based political conflict, where you have people who are at the bottom in every dimension vote for one party, and people who are at the top in every dimension vote for the other party. Then this has changed over time. It has gradually changed. It started very early, and that's important in order to try to understand the cause of this evolution. Starting in the 1970s, 80s, higher education voters tend to vote more and more for the left, and starting in the year 2000, 2010, you really have this, what I refer to as a multiple elite party system, in the sense that high education elite vote more for the left, while high income, high wealth elite still vote more for the right, although less and less so. So that's why, you have the conflict, if you want, between the parties that's favored by the intellectual elite and the other one by the sort of business and income and wealth elite, which I refer to as Bremen left, merchant right, in reference to the fact that, as you probably know, upper caste in India historically were divided between the sort of intellectual priest class, the Brahmin, and the Kshatriya and Vaishya, which were more the warriors and merchants and businessmen. So warriors do not play such a big role today, although the military in the US is quite important. But so the merchant elite or business elite is a more relevant comparison with the intellectual elite. Now, I argue that this evolution, can contribute to explain a number of important facts that we all care a lot about, including the rise of populism. So, I'm saying it's difficult to understand the rise of what we call populism today if we don't try to understand at the same time the rise of elitism or the rise of multiple elite parties. So when you have a situation where the two parties alternating in power, at least in US, UK, France, in the recent decades, are one most favored by high education elite, one most favored by high income elite, there's a possibility, it's not necessary, but there's a possibility that it can contribute to the fact that people who are at the bottom in every dimension feel that they are not really the priority for anyone. Now, by saying this, I should say that I'm going beyond what I really have to present to you. Right now, I'm going to present some descriptive material. I have the presumption that multiple elite system is not too good for redistribution, and that class-based party system put the issue of redistribution and reduction of inequality more at the center of politics. So there's a presumption in what I'm going to say that it's a bit better for reducing inequality. But look, it's complicated. Multiple elite system can also be good on other dimensions. And the normative discussion is something much more complicated than what I can offer today. So today, I'm going to show you descriptive theories, and then you can interpret them in different ways. It could also be that voters misperceive completely what parties are proposing. This happens sometimes. But if this happens for many decades in many countries, then maybe the perception problem is also on the other side as well. So I think it's now. Are we going to stay forever with this multiple elite system? Well, as I mentioned here, it could be that high education, high income voters will unite somehow again in the future. And to some extent, this is already what's a little bit happening if you look at the recent election in US and France, where you have a conflict that in some ways can be described more as a globalist versus nativist conflict and than a left versus right conflict. So this is the system is in a transition, and maybe this is close to something that we have, of course, in Hungary, in Poland, to some extent. Now, I'm not here to predict what will happen. The main message here is more that with many dimensional conflict, many different evolution can happen, and different political strategy matter. And we will see, for instance, with Britain in 2017, that in fact, if anything, we have the multiple elite system seems to reinforce itself. So let me show you a couple of graphs to put numbers of what I've just described. So this is the first graph on France. So this is a simple indicator. This is the difference between the percentage of university graduates voting for the left and percentage of non-university graduates voting for the left. Okay, so I put population into two groups. Either you have a university degree or you don't. Now, at the beginning of the period, this was negative, which means what? Which means that the university degree people voted more for the right than for the left. At the end of the period, it's positive, which means the opposite. Okay, so you have a clear long-run evolution. Now, if you put the US, this is what you have. So very similar evolution. And also here I have put control. So this is controlling for the effect of age, gender, income, which is going to affect the level, but is not going to affect the trend. So, it's not, the reason why, if you look at the end of the period, you could say, well, okay, this, university graduate people, they vote for the left because they are younger than other people, and younger people vote for the left. Well, okay, that's partly correct, but they were also younger at the beginning of the period, and they voted for the right. So, in fact, once you control for income, for age, gender, income, etc., you change a little bit the level, but the trends are the same. Now, if you put Britain, so this is the Labour Party. So you can see that the Labour Party in level is always a little bit less than the French and the US parties, which I think can be interpreted as the fact that the Labour Party was more explicitly lower class party for a long time. As you know, and I'm talking with an expert on the Liberal Party of Canada, which has some, similarities with the Liberal Party of Britain, except that the Liberal Party of Britain disappeared, as we all know. And so you remember, Keynes in the 1930s has this famous piece saying why he would never vote for the Labour Party and why he will keep voting for the Liberal Party until his death. And he said, basically, his justification is, well, these people in the Labour Party, basically, they don't have an intellectual elite. They don't know what they are talking about. I mean, these people are mindless. And the people, the good party is the Liberal Party. Now, he died in 1946, and had he remained alive longer, probably he would have become, a Labour Brahmin and voting for the Labour Party. But this would have taken him more time. Okay, so I think this part of what we see here is that the Labour Party, it took a longer time for the Labour Party to attract the high education elite, as compared to the French socialists and communists, which have been quite good, like the US Democrats. Okay? The even better graph I want to show you now is this one, which is exactly the same, except that I look at the top 10% education voters versus the bottom 90% within a cohort. Because, of course, the percentage of university graduates has increased a lot over time. So in the previous graph, when I compare university graduates with non-university graduates, this is a very small minority that is university graduate at the beginning and a much bigger minority at the end. So when I look at the top 10%, it's even stronger because, in fact, today, the relation is really monotonically increasing. So, if you get to a master or a PhD degree, you vote even more for the left or the Democrat. So you can see here, if you look at the case of the US, it used to be minus 20. Now it's plus 20. This is very strong. Okay, minus 20 means that, the percentage of the population voting for the high education people was 20% lower initially, and now it's 20% higher. So it's a complete transformation in the pattern of cleavage. If you look at the actual numbers, so this is for France. So you can see in 1956, the more educated you are, the less you vote for the left. 2012, the more educated, the more you vote for the left. So you go, I don't show you all years, but if I show you all years that are in the paper, you will see at the beginning of the period, it's always declining monotonically. At the end of the period, it's always increasing monotonically. So, you have limited sample size, it's only 2,000, 4,000 observations, but in fact, the standard errors are, perfectly fine. You have a very robust change in the pattern. Same in the US. So you can see in the US, the high education people used to vote Republican. So, it's wrong to believe that students have always been left-wing, or maybe when they are really young, but once they get a bit older, they used to be very right-wing. University graduates, you can see here in the US, and you can see in France, in the 50s, or even actually in the 70s. Now, this has changed completely. So you can see at the end of the period, you can see the PhD, people with a PhD in the US, it's only 2% of the population, but 75% of them voted for Hillary Clinton. Well, I don't even know where the other 25% are, and maybe they misreported it in the survey. But so it has become monotonically increasing, except for people who are high school dropout, but this is mostly because of a minority effect. And if you control for that, it has become monotonically increasing within the white population. Now, let's compare the evolution of the education gradient with the income gradient. So here, what I do, starting with France, and then I will show you US, Britain, and then I will also introduce Wales, is I compare, so the red curve is the curve that I have just shown you for education. So this is showing that the high education people have turned from right to left. Now for income, they still prefer the right, even though less and less so. So the last point, 2017, is a bit strange because with the Macron election, if you take, I will come back to the first round of the presidential election in France, and I will argue at the end that it's better analyzed as an election with 4 quarters rather than two halves. But so there's a question of, are we going to turn, is the blue curve also going to turn positive? So this is actually what you have in the US. So in the US, you see that in 2017, for the first time, the high-income people left the Republican and voted for Hillary Clinton. Now, it could be because Trump was particularly crazy, and once the Republican Party comes with a more reasonable candidate, the financial elite and high-income elite goes back to the Republican. So this is where, we don't know, and this is where party strategy matters, and, what are the platform, is going to have an impact. But in any case, you can see that there's a possibility that we have a complete reversal of the political cleavage, where initially, high-income education voted for Republican, and at the end of the high-income education voluntarily Democrat. So that's a possible outcome. Now, that's not the only possibility, because now if you look at Britain, you can see, well, it's different, because in Britain, well, the high-income people don't like Corbyn too much, okay? So in 2015, 2016, you actually, the gap between the high-income, high-education. So I think these graphs are important because, well, first of all, what this shows is that the distribution of education and the distribution of income, of course, are not perfectly correlated, because if they were all perfectly correlated, we could not have this. So some people have both high education and high income, and they are a bit lost on what to do, between the different objectives that they may have in life, but you have sufficiently many people who have either one or the other so that you can actually identify separately the impact, and it's extremely significant. So what the British example shows is that you could actually have a stabilization of this multiple elite equilibrium, like in Britain, or a reversal toward what I call a globalist versus nativist approach with both the high income, high education preferring to vote for the Democrats because they feel that the Republicans have really become too crazy, including for their economic interest. But, you know, the two, here, I should say the Corbyn vote is partly also a vote of people who didn't like the Brexit push by the Conservatives and who thought that by voting Corbyn they have actually a better chance to stay in Europe, which maybe is not a completely crazy computation. So I understand that I have 10 minutes left, which is exactly what I need, so that's perfect. So this is the standard errors. So you can see that this is highly significant. So this is for France. Also, I have put in green the wealth gradient. So you can see that the wealth, so this is exactly the same computation as before, but now for the top 10% wealth group vis-à-vis the bottom 90%. So you can see that the green curve is always below the blue, which is always below the red, which means that high wealth people are always more right-wing than high-income people who are always more right-wing than high education. So this is always like this in every country. You know, property is really more a right-wing thing, at least in this part of political history. You know, I'm not saying there's nothing universal about that, but in this particular time period, running over a couple of decades, this is what we have, which also can help you understand, you know, why the high-income people are a bit lost, because in a way, you know, income is a sort of average of wealth and education. You know, well, both are important. You know, income is both labor income and capital income. It's both human capital and non-human capital. So the high human capital people tend to vote left, the high wealth people tend to vote right, and the income in between, you know, they are a bit lost between these different. Now, this is the same evolution after control. This is for Britain. So again, you can see that the high wealth people in Britain, you know, they don't like the labor too much. High education have turned labor. So I think there are patterns here which are quite striking, especially comparing three countries with very different party system, very different political history, you know, completely different in many ways. And the fact that we have such similar evolution calls for explanation. Now, I don't have answers to all questions, but let me list a number of open questions and possible answers. First, what is the relation between the transition to a multipolar cleavage and the rise of globalization, immigration? You know, many people feel that one of the reasons why education has started to have a different roles and income is the attitudes toward universal values, broadly speaking, and in particular, perceived proximity towards other culture and migrants coming from other parts of the world. And certainly, you know, if you look at each of these countries, there's a key role played by racism, anti-minority strategy. In the US, this is very well known that, you know, the white flight from the Democratic Party started right after the civil rights movement. So, but what's interesting here, I think, is that usually in Europe, we tend to look at the US party system as a very strange and mysterious system. You know, how is it that the Democratic Party, which was the party of slavery, slowly and gradually became the party of the New Deal and then the sort of left-wing party. And so we feel in Europe very often that, you know, it is very difficult to understand. I think, in fact, the fact that we have such similar evolution in recent decades, you know, shows that, you know, I think there's a lot to learn from this comparison. Now, the point I'm trying to make also in this paper is that this transition toward this multipolar system, although it may have been exacerbated by the rise of the migration cleavage or the racial cleavage in the US, started before that. You know, if you look at, in particular, at France or Britain, you know, it started in the 70s, 80s, when the migration issue was becoming to be significant, but was not so significant. And one of the points I'm trying to make in this research is that I think there is some other process that's going on, which is that the educational expansion in itself has created new dimensions of conflict. You know, basically, as long as primary and secondary education are the objective, you can have a very egalitarian policy platform of bringing everybody to primaries and everybody to secondary. Once you get into the world of tertiary education, it's much more complicated because you cannot have as an objective, you know, 100% higher education or 100% PhD. So you have to deal with inequality and educational inequality in a way that is very new, and it's very tempting for the people who have been successful in education to sort of blame those who are not for their lack of effort or merit, and in the end reproduce the kind of meritocratic ideologies and the successfully business people have produced for a long time. And so I think here there is something that is more, I think it's too simple to just blame the racism of the poor, to summarize. You know, I think there's an effort to build an egalitarian ideology in a world with educational expansion, which has not been done yet. And in a way, the graph I have shown you at the beginning with the extremely unequal access to education in the US is an illustration of the fact that the winners of the system have not made much effort to try to make the system more equitable. The other open question is, can this multiple elite system persist? It's a complicated question, you know, to the extent that high education will lead to high income in the long run. In principle, you should have all the top groups should go for the same party. And in a way, as I said, you know, this is what we've seen recently in France and particularly in the US. Now, this itself could be unstable. You know, remember in the US, the sort of the racist party, the pro-slavery party, so I think you can call it a racist party in a pretty extreme manner, which was segregationist, gradually became the New Deal party. And this was a very gradual process. You know, it did not happen in one day. It was a very gradual process through which, by first defending the poor white, sort of led, in particular in the context of the Great Depression, to develop policies that benefited both the poor white and the poor black, and in the context of the Cold War and post-World War II context, the Democratic Party decided to go for the civil rights platform. So this, which, you know, this is what I call here a racist left trajectory, if you want. So I'm not saying, you know, this is what you know, that this is what's going to happen with Fidesz in Hungary or other parties like this. But I think this is a question, you know, this kind of transformation, which is very difficult to understand, you know, how the party of slavery in the US became the party of the New Deal. I think it's important to have a new look at this historical evolution and to question, you know, why is it that the Republican Party in the US did not become the party of the New Deal? Well, probably because in some ways they were captured by the business elite or by the high income and high education group in a way which did not let them to develop the kind of policies that would have been able to appeal to the low income and low education group in the middle of the 20th century. So, you know, I think looking at this again is important. I'm going to stop there just by saying that, you know, our common enemy is intellectual nationalism and the fact that each country tends to perceive sometimes to be unique and to the idea that we cannot learn from each other. I think we need to internationalize the study of political cleavage, and in particular the study of nationalist cleavage. You know, Lipset-Rokkan, which was a very important contribution to political science and looking at political cleavage, sort of ignored the racial and ethnic dimension. European political science in recent years, like Banshir, focused on the rise of the populist right and focusing on the dimension in relation to traditionalist versus universalist value, but focusing on Europe. I think looking together at US, Europe, and other parts of the world is important. Let me conclude here. You know, when you compare two countries like France and the US, you can see that in both countries, the racial dimension, well, has always been important in the US. It has become important as well in France. So in France, if you take the population, so if you run a survey in France today, and you ask people, do you have foreign grandparents? You have 30% who say they have a foreign grandparent. In fact, it's even more, but some people don't remember. I don't know. But it's a bit more than 30%. It's the true demographic data, but it's like 35. So anyway, we have 30%. You have 10% with extra-European origin, typically North Africa and a little bit sub-Saharan Africa, and 20% with European origin, which are mostly Spain and Italy and Portugal, basically, and very little elsewhere. So these are like the Latinos of France, if you want, you know, people with... except that the Latinos of France do not perceive themselves as Latinos and are not perceived as Latinos, and in fact vote like other voters, okay? And you know, you could say that's because of racial reason, which makes Latino in the US sort of intermediate between the white and the black. But I think it's more subtle than this. I think the policies themselves, which make people feel close to one another, you know, through education policies, through health insurance, through, you know, can create proximity between groups which are not particularly natural to begin with. In France, and I stop there for real, we have now really, you know, if you look at the recent election, we have what I call a four-quarter electorate. So here, you know, I divide the electorate between, you have about half of the population in France who says there are too many migrants, 56% exactly. It used to be 70% 20 years ago, so it's actually a bit better, but it's still half. You have about half of the population who says that we should reduce the gap between rich and poor and take the rich to the poor. Now, in fact, these two different dimensions are almost uncorrelated. So you get about 4 quarters once you cross the 2 dimensions. So this is what I call the internationalist egalitarian. So these are the people who say that there are not too many migrants and who say that we should take from the rich to the poor. The internationalist inegalitarians who say that they don't want to take from the rich to the poor, but who say that there are not too many migrants, etc. Now, these 4 quarters, as you probably have all guessed, are exactly the 4 quarters of the French presidential election. Well, I don't know how much you've been following the French presidential election, but for those of you who are interested in France, a very interesting country, the first round of the presidential election in France, you had about 4 quarters. Okay, you had 24% for Macron, 22% for Fillon, was the traditionalist right-wing candidate, 26% for Le Pen and Dupont-Aignan, which was another extreme right-wing candidate allied with Le Pen, and 28% for Mélenchon and Hamon, which were the people at the left of Macron. And they correspond almost exactly to these 4 quarters. So you can see that the Mélenchon-Hamon candidates are typically low-income Brahmin. These are people with, they have 39% of them are university graduates, but only 9% have income above 4,000 euros versus 15% in the rest of the population. The Macron have both high income and high education, even more so in education than the Fillon voter, but less so than the income of the Fillon voter. Now you can see the response to, are there too many migrants? So on average, 56% say there are too many migrants in France, but it's only 32% in the Mélenchon-Hamon electorate, 39% for Macron, 62% for Fillon, 91% for Le Pen, so this is clearly a strong predictor. And so for the, should we take from the rich to give to the poor? It's mostly the Mélenchon-Hamon and the Le Pen electorate. So this is where you get your 4 quarters. So these are the 4 quarters that you get at the end of the period. And you can see that over time, we get closer and closer to the 4 quarters, which I interpret as the sign that the political spectrum is really at a time of transition where, we really don't know in which direction this is going to go. Okay, let me stop there. Why is it that democracy does not reduce inequality? Well, probably because with multidimensional political conflict, it's complicated to put together people with so many different dimensions of inequality. So you have inequality in property, you have inequality in education, you have inequality in racial origins, you have all these dimensions of inequality. And if you don't have a strong egalitarian platform which sort of convince people from the low part of all these different dimensions that they have more in common than they have in difference between them, then the power of racism and nativism can be stronger than whatever is supposed to unite these people. The good news, I think, is that social sciences can help, and trying to better understand these issues in a as neutral way as possible. This is a difficult thing to do for some parties which are part of this evolution, and some people sometimes feel that they are part of what these parties have done. And I'm not trying to blame anyone, but I think we have to look at this evolution in order to improve things for the future. Let me stop there.